I'm not very keen on the whole abduction shtick. I think that one of the symptoms of cultural disintegration is simply that people lose the ability to distinguish between dream and memory. And that somehow one's past, one's real past and one's dream past simply become one's past. And then under certain circumstances, you know, what was basically dream material is presented as reality. You know, just because you have a nut theory, it doesn't mean that you agree with other nut theories. In fact, it often makes you very hostile to them. After all, there's a limited pool there that we're all... My idea with psychedelics throughout my whole career with them was that the purpose was to go out into mind space and hunt ideas and bring something back to show the folks around the campfire, something that would astonish and amaze us all. Well, you know, it's a narrow keyhole, the mind. You can't bring back a flower like the time traveler does in Wells' story. So I found the only thing I could bring back, not being graphically endowed, was ideas. It's a very mysterious business, the revelation of to mind of the world. Since the last time I talked to any audience, I finally understood an argument of my enemies that I had never understood before. Enemies in the friendly, collegial, ideological sense. In other words, enemies. The countervailing theory to the evolution of consciousness, how it came to be so rapidly, as opposed to the idea that it was stimulated by psychedelic compounds in the early human diet, was, and I've ridiculed this idea to you before, the idea that human beings throw things. And because we were small and weak and we hunted very large animals, we learned to hurl rocks with great accuracy. And that this is a behavior not observed in the animal world. I mean, monkeys hurl feces in a generally downward direction to indicate displeasure, but their aim is lousy, which is a very fortunate thing if you're an Amazon explorer. But human beings can hit with considerable force an object up to 120 feet away. And evolutionary biologists have fastened on this as requiring so much coordination of neural material that there would be enough left over to invent Western civilization and explore the planets once you had this thing down. Well, it always seemed somewhat preposterous to me. And I pointed out that it would make the big league baseball pitcher the paradigm of evolutionary accomplishment in the human world if that standard were accepted. But now I understand the argument a little better. And it's slightly deeper than I thought. Because here's what they were trying to say the first time. It isn't this neural coordination which is going on is really about planning. That it is an extraordinary thing to look at a rock in your hand and to make the calculation into the forward vector of the future. Aha, if I hurl back and impart a certain energy in a certain direction with a certain intensity, this thing will follow a path through space and will land somewhere with benign consequences to me and my side. And it's the key concept in here is plan. This is a plan. And animals don't do this. There are no plans in the animal world. Their consciousness is of the moment and doesn't involve this complex triangulation out of the moment toward future consequences in quite this way. Because you see, what happens when you let go of the rock is that you can no longer control it. It isn't like hunting or beating something to death with a stick, where the strategy is being readjusted moment to moment. No, once the projectile is released from your hand, that's all the planning you get to do. So it represents a concrescence of intent. And this building toward a concrescence of intent, this plan making, then is the tiny flutter of the butterfly's wing that ripples out through the chaotic universe, and the next thing you know, the kings of Babylon are issuing their codes of law, and slaves under the lash are erecting cities, and the stars are being brought into a mathematical model, so forth and so on. Well, I just wanted to mention that. I'm also working on a second book at the moment where we're going to go back into the Psilocybin theory of the origin of consciousness and actually attempt to make a case that will demand attack. In other words, to actually marshal all of the anatomical, paleontological, primate data, because the more we research, the more it appears true that by looking at the psychedelics, in fact, they become a kind of key to understanding the entire phenomenon of human emergence by looking at the larger issue of food as an environmental dimension. In other words, our food has shaped us. As omnivores, we have exposed ourselves to a very high input of mutagenic material over the course of our omnivorous behavior. And this has accelerated the rate of mutation in our species. This is why there are so many cancers. Those cancers are maladaptive mutations. Most mutations are non-productive. But by being a creature of the jungle canopy, who underwent a forced migration to an entirely different nutritional environment, the grassland, we opened ourselves up to this mutagenic influence. And it's only the spectacular effect of the psychoactive compounds impacting on neural organization, cognition, and social organization that I focused on originally. But now the realization is beginning to ripple out through the evolutionary community that yes, this is the hidden factor, the mutagenic diet and the forced shift in environment. There are also ideologically unexpected twists and turns in all this. I've recently met a very interesting person. He's going to be my co-author on this evolution book, Philippe de Vaugelet. Some of you may know him. And he is a lover of animals. This guy has made a fortune in publishing books on reptile care. And if you have a broken iguana, he's the man to see. But he pointed out something to me very, very interesting, which goes against prevailing political correctness for sure, which is that browsing ungulate animals have absolutely no interest in the behavior of other animals. They couldn't give a hoot. Who's interested in the behavior of other animals are hunting animals. And that in order to successfully hunt an animal, you must, in a sense, be able to become it. You must be able to transfer your consciousness into it and imagine its motivations, its behaviors, so forth and so on. And so Philippe has convinced me that on one level, the earliest human consciousness was not human consciousness at all. It was primate ability to enter into the behavior patterns and psychologies of other mammals in the grassland environment that it was predating upon, following vultures as a basis for the beginning of nomadism and this sort of thing. Obviously, predator animals are aware, and their evolutionary success is based on environmental awareness and being able to act based on inputting the behavior of other animals. This is a very complex mental world compared to the world of the fruitarian, leaf-eating canopy browser that we came from. And then it appears, that in a series of coalescing involutions of culture and neural organization driven by the spatial coincidence of human beings, cattle, mushrooms, our original primate programming was restructured. And I've talked a great deal about this. I think this is the key to understanding at least our sexual politics. All primates have what are called dominance hierarchies. And this is where the hard-bodied, sharp-fanged males, young males, arrange everybody else to suit themselves. The elderly, the sexually available females, the young, homosexuals, the sick. Everybody gets told where to stand and what to do. This is how primates operate. This is how we operate. However, I think that for a long period in human beings, this was interrupted by nutritional factors and drug factors in the environment. That in a sense, a human society that is using psilocybin on even a lunar cycle of use is suppressing the ordinary pattern of male dominance, hierarchical dominance. It's not genetically touching it. It's still there, but in the same way that if you give a population of aggressive people a lot of opium, aggression disappears. If you give a population of people a kind of psychedelic boundary-dissolving aphrodisiac that promotes group bonding and erodes monogamy and so forth, then you get a different social ambiance than if that weren't present. And I think the secret to understanding our curious relationship to the angelic and animal worlds has to do with the fact that under the influence of this hormone/enzyme, which was suppressing ordinary patterns of male dominance, consciousness underwent an extraordinary series of bifurcations. And language, theater, poetry, magic, religion, dance, music, ethical values, altruism, everything emerged, sometime between 35,000 and 10,000 years ago. The Paleolithic, the pre-agricultural era, an extraordinary period of novelty being expressed and conserved in the biological world. The primate species, the hominids, suddenly just take the stage and through an amazing series of cultural transformations become a planet-ruling species by 10,000 years ago. And then, not content with that, the process doesn't slow down, it accelerates. And this has to do with the fact that we have somehow created, through language, a kind of adaptive strategy that is so flexible that unlike most adaptive strategies, which sooner or later run into a blind box canyon and are just simply trapped there, butting their heads against the wall, you see it everywhere, the mussels down on the rocks, and most evolutionary developmental lines are dead ends. But somehow we broke free of that by ceasing to be defined by the physical body, which is the stuff upon which evolution works, and placing between ourselves and our environment a new thing called culture. We began to mediate evolution. Evolution says the infirm, the idiot, the lame must die. Culture says we have different values about this. Maybe yes, maybe no, but we will decide. Evolution says, you must be a scattered species, nomadic, and moving across the surface of the planet like an animal. Culture says, no, we have strategies for food sequestration and common defense, and we will build cities, and so forth and so on. And so, since about pick a number, 10,000 years ago, evolution has not been the dominating factor, biological evolution. Instead, there is something else, which the word epigenetic has been suggested, meaning change not driven by genes. Our genes are the same. If you were to be with a group of people active 10 to 15,000 years ago, they would look and just like you and I. We haven't changed that much. We've mixed the genes, but we haven't particularly added new ones or lost genes. But in the epigenetic realm, how many languages have been generated over the past 10,000 years? How many world religions have come and gone? How many systems of government? How many theories of polity and society? We just furiously cast these things off. And beginning about 500 years ago, this phenomenon was embraced as a permanent aspect of human existence in Western Europe, and the concept of progress became enshrined. And progress is the idea that this process must go on, be extended, and accelerated everywhere. And now it seems to be happening. I think, and as a consequence of this acceleration of process, all the contradictions in the old system, and I mean reaching back to Egypt, all the contradictions in the old system are now on the surface. And because I believe psychedelics are a kind of higher dimensional sectioning of reality, I think they give the kind of stereoscopic vision necessary to hold the entire hologram of what's happening in your mind. The old paradigm is gone. I mean, we can talk about how different parts of it died. Maybe not everybody knows the story of how physics, the paradigmatic science of reason, turned into a place where nothing makes any sense at all, and where stories are told so wild that a surrealist painter would flee from the gathering just shaking his head. That's physics. The very bedrock of the whole Western shtick has turned into a place of utter psychedelic contradiction and chaos. And the news hasn't reached biology and psychology. They're still operating under different paradigms. But what is keeping science alive at this point is the fact that it is able to whore itself to the marketplace. But in terms of the old program, which was providing some kind of metaphysical recitation of the nature of the universe, it's pretty clearly out of reach at this point. I mean, the universe has been discovered to be stranger than you can suppose. And what this means to the troops, which is you and me, the citizens of these linear, print-created, scientism-ruled, democratic, industrial states, what it means to us is that you get your mind back. They have no need of it anymore. It's actually become a burden to them. I mean, yes, they struggled like hell to take it, but then they discovered that it really wasn't worth all that much anyhow. The great thing about living in the twilight of an imperial decline is the permission that exists. You know, incredible resources lay before us, and very few people are looking over your shoulder and telling you what to do. I mean, the fact that this community has been able to persist and exist, I mean, this is the Orphic community. This is the tradition of descent, ecstasis, sexual ambiguity, so forth and so on, that reaches right back to Chalcolithic Greece and beyond. And shamanism is about shape-shifting. Shamanism is about doing phenomenology with a toolkit that works. And no religion, no philosophy, I think, has ever gone very far down the road of understanding. Understanding is not really a collective enterprise. Understanding is an individual enterprise. And, you know, you can read Husserl and you can become a Hasid, or you can assimilate these group understandings that are forms of wisdom. But ultimately, those are platforms for intrepid exploration. And now, at the end, I think, of this entire enterprise, I mean, I don't know whether I'm changing or the world is changing or both, but it has gotten so rich recently that it's like an enormous meal at some over-reviewed restaurant where you just have to push yourself away and say, you know, the spectacle is endless and amazing, and apparently it's all going to come true. And my impulse is to distance myself from it all. I mean, it is... well, the mushroom said to me once, it said, this is what it's like when a species prepares to depart for the stars. This is not unusual. I mean, the earth quakes, the oceans boil, the planet came into existence for this. All life for over 1 billion years has been pointed toward taking this step. You know, leaving the oceans for the land was dress rehearsal for what will now be done. And, you know, it's chilling because it's so huge. I mean, you don't even know, well, it's just enormous. And yet, apparently, when you look back through the history of the universe, this is how it proceeds. Incredibly gradually, over staggering scales of time, but then every once in a while you come around the corner, and there it is. A continent sinks, an asteroid impacts, a star explodes, two intelligent species meet somewhere out in the cosmos. And these things then, you know, set ripples going for eons. Yeah.
I'm curious what this has to do with psychedelics, because it seems to me that, you know, when you use psychedelics to break down perceptual barriers, that's one thing. But there's such momentum going on in the world today that things are breaking down without psychedelics, although it may appear psychedelic in terms of the way you see it. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I do.
You know, I mean, so at this juncture, have we transcended psychedelics?
Well, my idea is, that the psychedelic recapitulates on the personal scale this universal meltdown that is going on without the need of psychedelics. But this universal meltdown is very frightening to people. Most people are pattern-oriented and nostalgic, and it scares them. And I think psychedelics are a way it's sort of like doing calisthenics in preparation for the marathon at the end of time. People who have taken psychedelics should be in a better position to reassure everybody else. They'll just say, well, people will say, the laws of physics are breaking down. You said, look, I've seen it before. So, and in a way, this event which wants to emerge, we think of it as quantized in a single moment where the shift will happen, and it's like the glory or something. But in a way, our job, if we have a job, and I'm not sure we do, but if we have a job, then our job is to anticipate this and to live it out before it happens. Somebody very dear to me said to me 25 years ago, my God, I don't know how actually it was in the same conversation where they said history is the shock wave of eschatology. How anybody could say that in 1975, I do not understand. Anyway, he also said we should live as though the apocalypse has already occurred. That's the only way to transcend the historical hysteria, because the historical hysteria is about this thing which it might happen, it won't happen, it will happen. No, you say, it did happen. It did happen. So enough about that already. And we are building, each thing that we do anticipates this deeper fall inward into the dream. The dream is what awaits us at the end of history. The dream, and you can call it hyperspace or cyberspace or the trans-death realm, but what it really is it's a going into the dream. And what is the dream? Well, the dream is a place where the laws are set by the imagination. The imagination is God in the dream. And if there is a way for us to mirror our highest aspirations, in other words, to inculcate the God image in ourselves, then it's by becoming the masters of our dream, and then creating through drugs, technology, magic, who cares, the details come later, creating a way to share that so that we each then are a God with an open office doorway to all the other gods who wander through looking at the cosmogonies that we produce as art. I was thinking about this morning because I was thinking, what am I going to say to these folks? And I was thinking about the Platonic triad of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And sometimes people have dissed me and my obsession with hallucination because they say, well, LSD doesn't really cause hallucination. It causes insight and complex thoughts. But why are you so focused on visual hallucination, which I am? I mean, if it doesn't do that, I'm not interested. And then I thought the way into it is Plato talks about the good, the true, and the beautiful. But the key concept is beautiful, because good, it's abstract. True, it's abstract. But beauty is felt, perceived with the senses as music, as painting, whatever it is. And so the bridge to the metaphysical absolutes of truth And the good is through the palpable realm of the beautiful. And to my mind, this is what these psychedelics achieve. You know, they as Huxley said, you know, they dial open the valve of consciousness, or as Blake implied, you know, the window of perception is cleansed, and then you see through into an infinite, holographic, recursive world of mind and affectionate intelligence. And somehow this mystery is in the body, and therefore outside of time, and therefore beyond, in some sense, the reach of culture. Sex is like this to some degree. Sex is in the body and outside of time, and culture spends a huge amount of its energy trying to reach sex, trying to contort it, push it one way or another, and has produced some pretty bizarre themes and variations, but generally speaking has failed. I mean, no society certainly has ever gotten rid of sex, even though, you know, there have been societies ruled for 1,000 years by men wearing dresses, but it gave us some of the most ribald minstrelsy around. So there is this mystery in the body. I'm now returning to the subject of psychedelics, beyond the reach of cultural manipulation. And discovering this and exploring it is somehow the frontier of maturity. Culture is a form of enforced infantilism. You know, it's the last nursery, and most people never leave it. And they are perfectly happy to interpret the world through the reassuring nonsense of their cultural values, whatever they may happen to be. The reason psychedelics are so politically dynamite is because they cast doubt on this final cultural envelope of insulation. And they do it very democratically. It doesn't matter what your cultural conditioning is. It falls into question under the influence of the psychedelic. And then, for most people, that's frightening. Frightening enough that they not only don't want to do it, but they are also keen to see that other people don't do it, because they realize this is some kind of a doorway through which demons come. Disruptive ideologies, strange forms of music, bizarre behaviors, unpleasant fashions. It's all coming from this place where these people are messing around. And so there is an impulse to close it off. And so there is, you know, a tradition 50,000 years old of shamanism / bohemianism. People who are deputized to be weird and are told, okay, you be weird. We'll give you a hut at the edge of the village. You be weird, and if we need you, we'll call. That's basically the role. No, don't buy, we'll call you, you know. I mean, the political position of shamans is fascinating in these societies because they share it, but they are not of it, you know, and they're only asked in when things are really desperate. And I think, you know, bohemianism, this Orphic tradition I've talked about, this that goes back, way, way back, is the continuation of that. And so we here represent, to some degree, a self-selected group of these Orphic eccentrics, who carry this charge of otherness. In many languages, the word shaman means go-between. Go-between. Shaman moves between levels, and the mythologies differ, you know, either into a spirit world or an ancestor world or an animal world, but the go-between. And Now let me see if I can tie this all up. Oh, I know. I wanted to follow this thing out about the suppression of male dominance through chemicals and diet and psilocybin and all that. The reason that is fascinating to me, aside from the fact that it answers some real conundrums in hominid evolutionary arguments, is that it then has an implication for the present, because we are the damaged heirs of a damaged cultural style which has been practiced now for about 7,000 years. And, there have been various corrective measures, all failures, I think. Christianity, Christ, a corrective measure, somebody who comes who says, don't do it that way, and they get rid of him, and within 50 years the church he founded is dealing real estate. And, then you get it in Islam, another corrective effort. But these things have not worked. The cultural style has been too toxic. And with the rise of modern science and the acceleration of the toxic consequences of bad ideology, we now come to the 20th century. And throughout the 20th century, there has been an impulse,
What means bad ideology?
Ideology that has consequences that are bad for the environment and the gene pool.
Who knows what is bad for the environment?
Well, nobody knows absolutely, but when you think about things like plutonium and nuclear weapons stockpile, I agree with you that in the largest picture, moral relativism makes it impossible to say anything about good and bad. But I'm not that morally relativistic. I think biology should be preferred over its absence, and that intelligence should be preferred over its absence. So I'm because I think the universe wants to preserve novelty. That could actually be the basis of a kind of ethic. Bad is that which destroys novelty, and good is that which promotes it. It sounds awfully progressive. I remember the first time I was in Pakistan and I caught this rickshaw into Lahore, and this guy was being pulled by a human being, muscle power. And this guy said, "Oh, you're an American, this and that." And he said, he said, "This country is screwed up. This country is really screwed up." And I said, "Well, what's wrong with it?" And he said, "You want to know what's wrong with it? Progress. Too much progress." And this was a man who made his living pulling people around in a rickshaw. So, it's a relativistic thing. But what I wanted to say was, there is an intelligence in the species that is deeper than the societies and the systems that we erect to rule us. And this wisdom of the species can make enormous changes in the evolution of the mass psyche, such as the Renaissance, for example. And in the 20th century, this has taken the form of what I call the archaic revival. And one of my books is called The Archaic Revival. The 20th century, which is a vast stage crowded with different kinds of competing social phenomena, art movements, so forth and so on. Nevertheless, I think the entire thing is illuminated by the notion that what it is about is an impulse toward archaism. That in the sciences, the arts, everywhere, the archaic ideal is raising its protean head. And it begins with Freud in the early years of the 20th century, discovering by interviewing these Viennese bourgeois housewives that, human beings were brutes, and that, incest, rape, all the stuff was right below the surface. The rediscovery of the beast. And, certainly Germany developed that theme up into the 40s. Meanwhile, people were bringing African masks to Paris, and Cubism was basing its early theory on the deconstruction of primitive art. Meanwhile, people like Eric Satie were abandoning the canons of classical composition in music, and the 12-tone row was being experimented. Jazz was being given new attention, and for its primitiveness, its rhythm, its sense of something beyond the reach of civilization. Meanwhile, the deconstruction of painting that had begun with Impressionism, which, Impressionism is simply 20 minutes into LSD, had gone deeper, had developed first of all into the deconstructive spirit of Dada, where people tore up telephone directories and rang bells while they, did something else. In other words, the absurd appears for the first time, an enormous theme in 20th century life, just the incoherent idiocy of it all. And then surrealism, taking up the Freudian tune, begins to portray these worlds of distorted association and so forth and so on. Well, all this is about boundary dissolution. It was happening on the Bohemian left. It was happening on the fascist right. The rise of Marxism is a collectivist theory of society, very concerned with collectivism, so forth and so on. And then, enormous changes. Auschwitz, the atom bomb, space flight. And now where we are is, for 10, 15 years, there has been this awareness that it is about direct experience of the numinous, and it's been hideously marketed and raped by the entrepreneurial instinct, and peddled back to us as dozens of New Age cults diced up and presented as different from each other. But the impulse toward this authentic dissolving experience is real. It was there in Theosophy. It was there in the Beats. It came up through the hippies. It survived the trivialization of the New Age. And it has now found its way into the youth culture, into rave and house music and that whole thing, and it's healthier than it ever was. Well, the central figure in all of this, when you get it down to the idea that a culture must have a culture hero, meaning a paradigmatic ideal to constellate around, the central figure, it has been realized, is the shaman, who is, this person of indeterminate depth. Everyone else has a determinable depth. They are the linear cardboard people walking around. But the shaman is of indeterminate depth. That's why that's the secret of Carlos Castaneda's magic. He creates a literary character that in any other culture would be deemed mythical, but because of our attitude toward the depth of the shaman, we can't tell. We can't tell. And we deputize this kind of depth in rock stars, in culture heroes of various sorts, and worshipped that for the past 20 years or so. Well, then slowly it has dawned that the position of worshipper is not the most satisfying position. The only position that satisfies is to be that thing. And then at that point you're at the psychedelic crossroads, I think, because you will either make a how can I put it? Well, a conservative decision and seek a guru of some sort and be lost in that, which is a whole shell game. Or you will simply cut through the human domain and make a pact with a plant, a substance, and then you will, at that moment, be at the threshold of your adulthood. That's leaving home. Home is culture. Home is this fabric of imaginary values that have been created and maintained by a pathological culture. And so, it's a personal thing, ultimately. Very controversial, not easy to do. And then once done, it has to be integrated, dealt with, thought about. And that, as far as I can tell, is a task that extends well beyond the yawning grave.